It's the Polo Podcast. Welcome, everybody. Andrew here from Polo Reef. I have two very special guests here today. One flew in from one of my favorite places on this planet, Madison, Wisconsin, Dr. Craig Bingman, who is a major chemist, started in this hobby as a pioneer, is probably the expert on magnesium, alkalinity, calcium, invented it basically, and wrote numerous articles for magazines, gives tons of speeches, and also, I believe, was a Mazda of the Year recipient.
Yeah.
So highly credentialed. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And over to my left, I have our friend Mike Paletta, who needs no introduction. Mike, thank you always for being here.
I appreciate you having me, and I appreciate the amount of education we're getting to do to help everybody in the hobby.
That's the most important part. So, since you're both of the same generation and OG guys,
Yep.
I'm going to let you start asking the chemical equation man to start this off.
Well, as we talked about a little bit before, we're sort of in the mindset that what was old is new again, in terms of people are going back to halide lights, people are going back to doing water changes, things like that. But one of the things that may not, but they should be going back to, is the use of good live rock versus dead rock. Now, I'm curious as to what your experience and what your feelings are of the advantages and disadvantages of good live rock versus dead rock.
In other words, the biome conversation.
It's the beginning of it.
Yeah. So I've set up a couple systems with just dead rock, and that's a tough row to hoe. It's a really long,
right,
ugly start with those. I think that if you could do all live rock, that would probably be the best, good quality live rock, right?
Pests included?
So that's the downside,
I never
right?
had pests with the rock.
You never know.
Yeah,
crabs or whatever. You never know.
You could get a manna shrimp. Some people wind up with like an octopus that comes out of like nowhere, right? Crabs, there's all kinds of stuff. Worms, but it's such a rich ensemble of organisms that can come through. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of live rock, right? I mean, it can be like really heavily stepped on by the time you get it, and it's like zombie rock or, whatever.
Or not porous and a boulder's kind of form.
Right. Or, you could get stuff that was like handled like coral basically on the way to you. And one thing that can happen is if you buy like some zoanthids or soft coral or whatever on rock, that rock has been handled well. So you can actually get some nice, good quality, coralline algae and bacteria and everything coming in that way as well if you can't use any live rock, right? So it's but for a long time it was almost impossible to find good live rock the way that we would get it, back
in the 80s and 90s. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, we get it from Australia vis-a-vis one or two guys, and it's very expensive. It's now probably landed $40 a pound versus maybe 5 to 10 maybe when you guys were collecting.
Well, actually, we were paying for Fiji and Indo rock. We were paying like $2 a pound.
$2. So you're even older.
That was retail.
You're even older. That was retail. Yeah. Right, and the Marshall Islands and the Tonga, that stuff was beautiful.
Yeah. And now they use that rock to build highways and gravel pits, but they don't sell it to the hobby because we're destroying the reefs, which they don't quite understand.
Yeah, they burn it for lime to make concrete and that kind of stuff.
Now, the nicest live rock I ever got in, I helped a guy set up a 1,500-gallon tank, and we got in 2,000 pounds of Fiji rock. And my friends at Seed Dwelling took it from the plane that landed from Fiji, put it on a plane to Pittsburgh, flew it straight to Pittsburgh. We put it in his tank that night until 3 in the morning. There was never a smell, nothing. It was the most perfect, pristine walk, and we did find an octopus, as you mentioned, that came out of the rock, and it lived in that tank for probably another 2 or 3 months.
Right.
But that was the best live rock ever.
The Australian stuff that we get now, like, it needs to cure for, like, you know, and and sometimes it comes with so much shit on it. I'm sorry, the word, that like you wonder whether you should power wash it and essentially make it dead first, and using the shapes, and then and keep some alive.
Right, for the bacterial cultures,
right,
but the other
right,
livestock
right.
get rid of. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the nitrogen burden, you know, the die-off off of live rock that had a lot of stuff living in it, like peanut worms, and, you know, there's all kinds of stuff.
The old chicken liver sponge, remember that nasty stuff?
Oh, yeah, right. And you know, if it comes in bad, you know, like the plane, it gets dry, whatever, on the way to you, you're going to have a problem with that, right? So it's going to take a while before it comes into shape. You have to keep it in the dark for a while.
Right.
You know, it's good if you've got like maybe some sort of
skimmer on it or
biofilter, skimmer going in the
Yep.
system
And just leave it alone.
Or cure it hot at like 90, 92 degrees, so whatever's in there dies off except for the bacteria, and you grow the bacteria faster. I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do with it. But
Salinity too, people play with that way too.
yeah.
But I don't hear about anybody doing that anymore. Is that like it's still a thing? Or?
No, nobody does that anymore.
No, the guys that
that
import the live stuff, like my buddy Jason Giannis,
Right.
which is pristine aquariums, it comes in boxes with wet newspaper, you know,
Right.
and there's tons of stuff on it,
organisms on it.
tons,
Yeah.
and it's a little stinky,
Yeah.
sometimes,
Right.
depending on the piece.
But I think if I mean, it just takes forever to get through the uglies if you don't have any live rock.
Particularly
in the system at
white
all.
marker rock.
Yeah. Marco rock takes 9 months, in my opinion, minimum. And that's, you got to inoculate it. You got to put some other rock from some other tanks in it to get it to go.
Right.
You got to add a ton of strontium to try and get the coralines to take off. It's just, yeah, I mean, the rock in my tank is now 30 years old. And it was Fiji rock from 30 years ago. And I've added pieces from here and there. And with Fiji coming back again, thank you, Walt Smith, I will add a couple new pieces of Fiji rock to re-inoculate it. Because that's one of the things we were talking about earlier with people still having old tank syndrome. Do you think it's allelopathy of the organisms and bacteria in that rock, certain numbers dominating versus the other ones going away, so you lose the diversity, and that's why you need to re-inoculate with live rock? Or do you think there's some other factors involved in that?
I think probably there can be a lot of contributors to what people call old tank syndrome. It is true that in small systems, stuff will just go extinct over time, just sort of like random population fluctuations, whereas that just doesn't happen in the ocean, right? So you can get these small system problems. And yeah, adding some more stuff that would be fresh might help out with that. I mean, you get stuff building up, you get atrophy of your enthusiasm, right? Like old, Lars sort of syndrome.
Yeah.
All that stuff can contribute. Stuff builds up in the rocks that you can't get it out anymore. So that's great that 30-year-old live rock is that it's been going that long is fantastic, that you haven't had to like strike the tank and start over again.
No, it's went from a 500, then I added it to a 1200, and it went to a 300, and then I used the same rock from the 300 and the 500. I basically cut back on the amount of rock.
Well, but every time you like redo the system, I think you can get rid of some of the problems that can creep up over time. So any detrital stuff, that would have been eliminated in the process of moving it back and forth. So that can help keep your system fresh, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Plus, taking out all the detritus that settled and finding where the dead spots are and manipulating things to minimize dead spots. I mean, in the 300, I had more dead spots than I have in the 500 because I know what was causing them and where they were. So anything you can do to prevent that, I mean...
Well, I think bigger systems tend to have better flow dynamics than smaller ones, right? Because the path for the water to travel is longer, and they usually take less pump, per unit volume to get this equivalent water flow.
Right.
Bigger systems do. So there's like all these scale things that you can think about with aquariums, like, well, this system's like, it's a 17,000 gallons.
By the way, it's probably a little lower now because we're running the pumps a little slower. Each inch is 1,000 gallons.
Right. So when I started thinking about this, I was like, I kept like catching myself because I wanted it to be one order of magnitude bigger than a 180. So I thought about 180 as sort of like a reference size system, as a commercially available tank. They were really popular when I got started. But this one's fully 2 orders of magnitude bigger than a 180, which is just like, okay, you got to get an extra 0 in there, Craig, when you're doing your baselines.
What? I know we spent some time talking about it on Facebook too when you asked me why are you adding nickel. I think that was the comment. And then we got into the whole trace element thing. Let's do a Craig Bingman analysis of ICPs. What's important? What's not important? The chemical guy, and where you are on that subject.
One quick question. In terms of trace elements, though, don't you think there may be some variability in terms of sometimes some are more important than at other times? Like, whenever I've had STN outbreaks and I upped nickel, that seemed to slow the STN outbreaks. And there's a paper that basically showed there's a lagoon in Indonesia where there's a nickel mine, and the nickel level there is 10 times what it is in normal. And during bleaching events, they basically had no bleaching events in the lagoon versus outside the lagoon where the nickel wasn't there, they had significantly more. That's one of the reasons I add nickel, just because of that paper. Granted, it may be somewhat anecdotal, but it's as close to scientific proof that one trace element may help with limiting pathogens.
Right. So trace elements are hard. ICP is hard for people. When we started, there's only a few parameters that we test, right? And that was kind of a lot for people. And now there's like the whole periodic table that you can think about. And when people started doing that, it was like too much, I think, for people. And there was like a real problem presenting that data. Now I think everyone at least sort of normalizes their data to like 35 parts per thousand salinity, right? Which is you can get in like a situation where like, oh my gosh,
numbers are off. My salinity.
Everything is low.
Right.
Well, there's not enough salt in the system.
That brings up 2 caveats. One, if you talk to 100 aquarists, I bet only 2 have their salinity exactly at 35. It may be 34.5. It may be 35.5.
But that changes the calibration solution.
But the second caveat on that is most of the people that are doing ICP, the ICP testers, don't change the values if you're not at 35. Some of them do, but some of them don't. So it leads to they're not changing the correlation.
Yeah, that's what I was pointing to, was that I think it's very positive for people to renormalize the values to some constant salinity, because then you can like get into this situation like where everything is low, right? And that's not what's going on.
Right.
Your salinity is just a little bit low. And so that's instead of like doing an operation for each of the elements, you do one operation, which is you put more salt in the system.
Right.
But for the major elements, I've said for a long time, and I will probably stick with this, that you can probably accommodate fluctuations of like 10% in all the ion ratios, and not have any problems with the system. I think that's actually probably
those are the major ones.
So sodium, chloride, magnesium, calcium,
10%,
potassium,
10%. How fast?
Sulfur.
Like overnight? Kind of 10% overnight, or
no? I mean just like
just
the
a little
composition of your water.
Can
if
be
everything
off by 10%.
is within 10%.
Right.
So
Got it.
Calcium 420 plus or minus,
if
40,
it's 450
42,
or
right?
400, it's fine. You're fine.
I think both of those are fine.
Yeah.
And ditto with potassium and magnesium and all the rest of that.
Right.
So those numbers all work. So that's a rule of thumb that sort of like works for the big stuff. and then you do minor elements. And there's not as much of those around. The big elements are important for like electrophysiology, right? So like the nerves don't work. You have too much potassium in the water, too much magnesium. They can be like narcotics for organisms because they're, they go to sleep because their nerves aren't working very well anymore. Ditto too low, that can also be a problem as well. But the minor stuff gets interesting.
A lot of people think magnesium, you can run it as almost as high as you want, 16, 17. Is that not what you believe?
You may be able to run it up there. I just don't know what the case is for running.
I don't either, by the way.
There's early work that basically said if you have algae issues, you can bump up the magnesium and get rid of the algae.
There was that.
And it started as anecdotal,
right?
And it has become gospel. So that's where it started from.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I think that you need to have near seawater concentrations of magnesium in your tank. Otherwise, the carbonate buffer system doesn't work right.
Right.
You get more pH fluctuations. There's a big demand on magnesium from coralline algae growth. So it's a parameter that definitely changes. But then you like bump down to the minor elements. And I think you can probably get more fluctuation in those. And people still do have. So bromide is a minor element, and some seawater mixes intentionally tried to exclude that because of problems with ozone.
And Rich, that was a long time ago, right?
Yeah, hydrobromates and toxic compounds when you use ozone and high bromide.
So I'm not sure where that's at now. Right? I think they have near seawater bromide in most of the mixes.
Yeah, that's not considered a critical trace element to add.
And people, I did that series of articles on the halogens, right? So it started out, bromine, fluoride, iodine.
Fluoride's another one.
Yeah, so fluoride's another minor element that I think should be in the mix, and it's good if it's now. Unlike bromine, that one actually the concentration will change quickly for fluoride. When I looked a really long time ago, it seemed like the half-life was maybe a week or less for fluoride to go to half of its concentration. It's going into coral skeletons, and I think it's probably doing some other stuff.
Has kept some of these trace element companies. It's their highest selling product in terms of needs. If you're a moonshine or something like that.
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion of how critical fluoride is. Because, I mean, in my own tank, it dropped down to 0.31. I brought it back up to 1.31, and I did see an improvement in the corals.
100%. 100%.
So I'll agree with them, but is it as crucial as they've made it?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe it can go down to 1, or just needs to be bioavailable.
Yeah.
You know?
So, curiously, the amount of fluoride that they put in drinking water is about the same amount that's in seawater. So if people were doing top-offs with water that wasn't processed with RODI, they would have been getting some actual fluoride in their system that way. Or if they made up the water, synthetic seawater and tap water. And, you can get by with that in some places sometimes, and other places most of the time, but you don't want to be, one of those times where it's, suddenly there's a lot of chloramines in the water or something like that.
But I'm sure where you live and I live, there's a lot of agricultural. So in the spring, especially when they fertilize a lot and you get rain and it runs off, our water comes out of the Allegheny River. The phosphate level was through the roof in the springtime. So obviously that's when I have to use RODI, and I'm assuming a lot of people that are around
I think it depends a lot whether or not they're extracting from surface water or if it's from wells. And, like you said, what's going on? What's the land use, sort of like what's going on there? So if you're lucky, you're out in the country, you got your own well, you know exactly what's going in there. But even then, I was talking to a guy, he's a dentist, he's in Wisconsin, and his well water was just fine until it wasn't. So there's this big lens of agricultural dominated water that had moved into his property. As stuff gets pumped out, right, water will move around. And he suddenly had really high nitrates that he'd never experienced before. So no one's, 100% safe. And if you're doing that kind of stuff, you'd have to probably do a lot of testing.
Well, I had a couple of friends lose their whole tanks because the municipal water authorities changed what they were putting in, didn't tell them, and it burned up their RODI cartridges where they used to wait like 6 months. It burned them up in 2 months. So for 4 months, they were dumping garbage
This
into
is the
their tank.
chloramine issue?
Chloramines and other stuff that they were
Right.
using to clean the water.
So there's a case actually for having a chlorine test kit. I
Yep.
think everyone should have still a chlorine test kit. And if you're worried about that, what you could do is, you fire up your unit and you let a little bit of water go through it. And then you just, after the carbon block, you do a residual chlorine test on it. And
Yeah,
if
it's
you
just
see,
a dip strip. And
if you see anything there, you've got a problem, right?
Yep.
It wouldn't take very much time.
No, it's
Something
cheap. It's
that-
like a $12 test. It's one of the things I do because they dump chloramines in it every now and then. And an RODI isn't particularly good at taking out all the
So
chloramines.
I actually use these Hawk strip test things, and they'll test for hardness and chlorine. And I will be able to tell if my water softener is working, which I have upstream in my RODI by how much calcium's coming through, and whether or not I'm getting any bleed through of chlorine through the RODI. So I used ICPs and everything else, but it's important to not get use what's appropriate, right? And sometimes something very, very simple can be an appropriate test.
Yeah.
The other test that I wish that they had was like a stable for 10 years ammonia test. And, you just need to have like one or two of them, in case of emergency, break glass, get this out, and see if there's too much ammonia in my system. A lot of people will get the liquid test kits and stuff like that when they're cycling their tank initially.
Right.
And then 5 years later, they don't have a valid ammonia test.
Right.
And they're curious something is happening in their system,
Right.
but they don't have any way to make that observation. So
Right.
having a stabilized ammonia test for emergency purposes would also be
Well,
nice.
that's interesting you say that because one of the things that we're starting to play with is adding ammonia to the tanks as a food for the corals instead of nitrates. I talked about this probably 4 months ago, and since then I've probably gotten 100 people asking
that going,
information.
by the way?
Everybody's been positive about it, which
You?
surprised me. I've been very positive about it. And you said your alkalinity increased consumption by about 20%.
Yeah. But the question, what your ammonia source is what exactly?
Ammonia bicarbonate.
Ammonium bicarbonate. And where do you get it from?
I bought it on Amazon.
Got it. Okay.
It's like $12 a pound, and you only add, I think it's 20 grams to 1 liter of makeup water, and to that I add 40 milliliters.
Well, how much does it raise the ammonia by? Like what's?
It's undetectable.
Okay, got it.
But I'm not adding more. I'm staying with the 40 milliliters because
got
that's
it.
been working.
Got it.
So the clam farmers used to add ammonia to their systems, but not as ammonium bicarbonate or whatever. They would just pee.
That was the old Dick
systems.
Perrin
Yeah, exactly,
joke.
right.
Dick Perrin used to grow clams, and we asked him what his secret was. He said, Eddie and I pee in the tank.
Right.
And that was,
So coral reefs in the wild actually have like a nitrogen limitation issue, and corals can be nitrogen limited. So it's not really surprising that adding some ammonia to systems could help, but I'm a little bit surprised that they're still ammonium starved if you've got a lot of fish in the aquarium.
Right.
Yeah.
We spoke about this for breakfast.
yeah.
And to loop back to nickel, it turns out that nickel is an enzyme that's required to break down urea in the enzyme urease. And fish, marine bony fish, do secrete some urea in the water.
strong urea.
So you would need to have enough nickel to have a complete nitrogen cycle in your aquarium and deliver ammonia to the corals. So that's kind of like a little
Okay. So
loop back through
if you're adding
several
ammonia,
elements.
you should be adding nickel to your tank too.
No, you wouldn't. Well, I think you probably need some nickel.
Yeah.
But it's really only the breakdown of urea to nickel or urea to ammonia
okay.
that requires the nickel in the enzyme.
Okay.
But feed your fish,
Yeah.
and your corals will be happier,
Right.
and you will be happier too because your fish won't look miserable.
I'm of the Andrews school. I can never have enough fish in my tank, and I've always had way more fish. You can't have that many fish in your tank, and it's always worked better for me. I was never a zero nutrient person, which
Yeah, I think having fish in a coral aquarium is a good thing for a lot of different reasons, right? It's a lot more interesting to look at, and I think it actually has benefits to the corals as well. So,
Well, I actually did a tank one time, a 240-gallon tank that was all corals because fish had been a pain. Every single person walked in and says, "That tank looks really nice, but where's the fish?" Every single person.
Yeah, and all the views on Instagram, they all want to see fish too.
Yeah, they
by
wanna
the way.
see fish.
The coral views don't do as well.
No.
well, especially like if it's all stony corals, there's like nothing
No
going
movement,
on,
right,
So
right,
if there's
right.
soft corals in there, at least there'd be a little
Right.
But
you
at
know,
least they're
moving back and
colorful now.
forth.
Remember when we just had brown sticks and the soft coral people were like, "Why do you want to have just brown sticks in your tank? We have movement, we have green." Remember that?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
were around
yeah.
that.
They're absurdly colored now, actually. I mean,
Right.
they
Yeah.
don't, people might be disappointed if they went diving on a real coral reef that's not, it's not like
Not quite as fluorescent.
unicorn explosion everywhere
No.
that you go.
Because literally 20 years ago, I set up a 5,000-gallon tank for a guy in Chicago, and he flew us to Fiji to hand collect the corals. We would literally swim over a football field to find one colorful coral. Everything was beige or brown.
It's brown.
Yeah, it's various shades of beige and brown, and occasionally you'd see green, and you're like, "Wow!" But I did see the nicest coral I've ever seen in my life there. It was the deepest blue acropora, staghorn acropora, and you saw it from like here, half a mile away.
Right.
And I was so enamored with this coral, I wouldn't let us take it or take a frag of it because it was just so spectacular on the reef. I mean, it was just literally a once-in-a-lifetime coral. I still have a picture of it.
Craig, where do you sort of see, after we figured out this whole, I mean, you figured out this whole alkalinity, magnesium,
Calcium relationship.
the relationship and analyze the two parts to death and all that stuff. Where's the next journey? Where's Star Trek going?
So I think that the trace element stuff isn't completely settled yet.
Right.
So there's still a little bit to do in the chemistry realm. But I do think that some of the most important things are going to be with like microbiomes and stuff like that.
That's what we were gonna.
People have been, like in 2023, there was just an explosion of papers on coral microbiomes.
Right.
Yeah, what I showed you.
Reading them now.
I've been reading them now. Yeah. No, that's one of the things, because it's not just understanding that there is a biome. The next step is understanding what's in the biome and then how to manipulate it from the understanding that a mini reef tank is not like the ocean. So you may have a microbiome similar to what's in the ocean, but it may be not as beneficial in a closed little glass box than it is out on the ocean. That's where the work is going to be, in my opinion.
So there's a paper that came out in 2020 where they they analyzed the microbiome of a bunch of different individuals of 3 species of corals. And I think the way that they're like, it was like really complex, and like, how are we going to simplify this? They found that about 3%, only 3% of the bacterial species that they identified were common among every single individual of that species. So there's like some species specific microbiome. And then the rest of it is just sort of like on an individual basis, what's going on with that particular coral. Some of it may be salient, important. Others is just like fluctuations, right? And cutting through that level of complexity, I think, is going to be very, very hard. But people are now culturing some bacteria that they've isolated from corals, and they are adding them back to corals who are under stress to see if it has any adaptive significance for the corals. And that work is ongoing now. And I think it's plausible that in like 5 years or so, there may be some bacteria-based things that we can do to help our corals do better in aquariums, and maybe even on reefs to help people help corals there do better when they're bleaching under thermal stress and stuff like that. So there's research in Australia, China, the United States, all over the world on this subject. It's really interesting.
Well, to even add to that complexity, some of the papers that I've read, it shows that the microbiome is different from on the polyps, in the mucus, in the gut. So it's even more than just individual corals. It's in the coral organism. I mean, you think of this little tiny animal, but the microbiome changes depending on where you are on that animal.
It's different on us. Our skin microbiome is very different than the stuff in our gut, right?
So it's not something unique, but understanding that in such a small organism to have such a rapid differentiation in different areas and how that's going to affect us. Because the next thing that we talked about earlier is adding to the microbiome in terms of providing bacteria and food and trace elements and amino acids.
This gets into the whole concoction and food stuff that's going on, and the carbon dosing with trying to feed corals, basically bacteria.
Yeah. Well, corals.
And you like that
hypothesis.
You like the idea, but not sure, right? Like you think we're onto something.
I think that adding bacteria as food to reef systems is something that we ought to be thinking about. The particular implementation seemed a little dangerous to me in terms of just like maybe you should be coming from purified strains or something like that and using sterile technique and not using the same bucket for 6 months and you know
that's exactly what we talked about earlier,
right?
Yeah, not adding your tank water that's already full of pathogens as the mix-up water.
Well, but if you got the good stuff in your tank already, then that would be a good place to go, right?
Yeah.
But you don't know.
You don't know. You're in there somewhere.
You're in like a knowledge deficit, all
right.
the time as far as that stuff's going.
Well, we talked about that in terms of even the commercial brews. No one tells you what bacteria in there. And I mean, I've looked at aquabiome tests of one additive versus another. One had like 3 bacteria, the other one had 15. Okay, is the 15 one better, or are those 3 the crucial ones? We don't know. I mean,
no, I don't think so. I think that people are going to start figuring that out, though.
Yeah, because we discussed we had problems with one group of bacterial additives. We're not saying the name, and we've had good success or relatively good success with other ones. So it's going to be like it was in the early years, a lot of trial and error, which is good and bad.
How important do you think the understanding of the organic side and the use of the UV spectrophotometer, that whole instrument is going to be in this world? Because we may get one here.
Yeah, so there's stuff that you can do with a UV spectrophotometer that is just very difficult, and it's not under the umbrella of ICP testing or anything else, right? So you can look and see how much color's in the water. You can test for.
You were the original carbon. You and Boomer, right? You did the test on how clear the water got, right?
That was one of the first 2 articles that I wrote. So I think it's cool to look out there. You can learn stuff. Is it worth that amount of money? It depends on who you are and what your budget is, right? So do I have one of those at home? No. Can I use one at work anytime I want to? Yeah, right. So if I was a public aquarium, yeah, absolutely. If I had a system of this scale, I think I would definitely have one. Some of this stuff isn't standard tests, though, right? So if you want to do that, we can talk, and I'll kind of show you what I did.
Yep. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with that, but not easy to use, the UV stuff, right? Well, you have to be trained a little bit.
So all of this stuff, like any time that you're measuring, very small changes in light absorption, you have to be very consistent in how you put the cells in. They have to be clean, right? If it's a round cell, even with the other colorimeters that people have in the hobby, I will put a mark on them. Or if there's marks on it, I'll make sure that they always go in a consistent orientation. Because if you measure, the transmission through them in different orientations, it can change. And it can change enough to affect your view of the results, right? So there's like this technique thing that you suddenly have to get concerned about when the test gets more precise. And that can be stressful for people, but it's like once you know once you're told what to do, then, it should just be better for you.
Well, and looking at that test, one of the things it may be useful for is looking at dissolved organics in the water, correct?
People do that. Yeah. I mean, there's a test, and you definitely do see, so you can see specific organics. You can see like a general yellowing trend in the water. So there's like all kinds of stuff in the water, in the chemical diversity of stuff that's just like floating around the water. It's all over the chart, right? And then you can also get some light scattering phenomena that happen as well, that get much stronger as the wavelength gets shorter. And then you will actually bump into some ions out there. So nitrate and nitrite actually have some UV absorption features around 220, 230 or something like that. And I remember the first time I ran a spec, and I was like really surprised by the stuff out there. And it took me a while to figure out what I was actually seeing. But
that's great. We'll be 5 years before we figure this out.
Yeah. Well, looking at organics, do you think that's one of the next things we have to look at in terms of better removal, better understanding? Or do you think in the early days, once we added a skimmer, we took out a fair amount, adding carbon takes out some? I mean, do you think there'll be a better methodology for both assessing it, understanding where it's deleterious, and being able to remove it better?
So I think it's hard to answer specific questions about specific organics. I do think that you can use a UV spec to get a general feeling for how things are going, right? Like, is my ozone system overall performing? Does my activated carbon need to be changed? Those are things that you could get a quantitative assessment from a system like that.
Right.
Well, where else do you think the hobby is going to go in terms of, we know we're going to look at the microbiome, we know we're going to look more at organics. There's some other areas. What do you feel, having been in this as long as we have, what do you think are the next
So
big jumps?
there's a long story about microalgae, right, and how I got interested in that kind of stuff. But the impetus for that, which is trying to keep non-photosynthetic stuff,
Right.
like, you know,
Yep.
that is unanswered now. We still can't keep a number of those organisms in our systems.
Right.
And I personally would really like for that to work, because if you had like a Dendronepthia sort of aquarium,
Right.
you wouldn't need to illuminate it as strongly. It
Right.
could be at a number of different temperatures, and it would be just absolutely spectacular, right?
Yeah.
But, once we get it done, once we figure out how to do it, then we'll have the problem of this stuff like growing in all the pipes and shutting things down. So you know what's going to happen, right? Because those will be the highest flow points in the system, and we'll all be like talking about how, Dendronepthia is a goddamn weed, and, it'll be like xenia,
Yeah.
right? So we have to like
You
get
take
it out.
the pipes out. You have to set up the
I
plumbing
wish
so you
I'd
can
never
take it
put
off.
that Dendronepthia in my tank. It's just all over the place.
Yeah, and then you'll also see like Red Sea, which has the most beautiful ones I've ever seen coming in. I mean, there's spectacular things that make the rainbow or whatever pale in comparison. And these are their natural colors. You can run them under white light,
Yes.
minimal white light, and they
Right.
would be spectacular.
Yeah.
So, no, I agree with that. Would be a
Which
really
then gets
big
into the
breakthrough.
whole feeding bacteria circle again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That may be the secret for keeping Dendronepthia and Scleronepthia and those organisms.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we are going to wrap this up, and please stay tuned for more. If you liked and subscribe, please like and subscribe this channel and this material. We want to bring more of it to you. And we are going to have a panel next with Bob Stark also sitting here. And stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Craig. And
Thank you, Andrew,
Mike,
as
for
always.
driving out here.